Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, also science, but not political science. But science and politics is good, except that yesterday it wasn't. During the COVID press briefing, Boris Johnson, who keeps insisting that his government has been led by the science, showed the world that he was doing anything but, for those who didn't already realise it. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So Boris Johnson took the daily COVID briefing yesterday alongside Vallance and Whitty, the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer, respectively. Naturally, health allowing, it should have been these three every single day. But it's not normally. In fact, it's very rarely. But this is really weird because this is the third time in a week Boris Johnson has fronted the briefing. But there was another day this week when it was also supposed to be Whitty and Vallance as well, all three of them. On Monday, Vallance and Whitty entered Downing Street in order to take part in the briefing that had to be delayed in order to allow for Cummings' desperate plea to the nation. But they didn't carry out that briefing. It was speculated at the time that they've refused to back Johnson's versions of events regarding Dominic Cummings, in particular, because obviously they're not legal experts, but in particular on the impact on the government messages essential to suppressing the rate of infections. And so he ushered in some other stooges instead. But last night all three were actually present, and it was clear that Vallance and Whitty had obviously decided that the Prime Minister had crossed a line that they were not willing to follow him over. As a result, Johnson was telling journalists what questions they may or may not answer, and he prevented Vallance and Whitty answering any question he didn't like the sound of, and there were a few. At one point, a correspondent, it's from Sky I think, asked the two scientists what they thought about being silenced by the Prime Minister. Naturally, they gave a diplomatic answer. I mean, what else could they reasonably do? They said that they didn't want to get involved in politics. Of course, they've willingly become involved in politics the second they agreed to take part in SAGE meetings that were packed out with Dominic Cummings as well as many other political appointments. It wasn't just him and a couple of others there. There were about 20 or more so far that we know about that are not eminent scientists at the top of their field, that are there as Dominic Cummings' crew and actively taking part in those so-called scientific meetings. So yeah, at that point, it was a political meeting and they did involve themselves in politics. And even the questions that they were allowed to answer were actually pretty grim. So it was noted that the R value, so the R value, again, just to be clear, is the average number of people. If you become infected, it's the average number of people you might be expected to infect. So that R value needs to be below 1. If it becomes above 1, then what it means is that for every person that becomes infected, on average, they'll infect more than one other person. And that means the whole thing goes out of control again. And they said that the R value was estimated to be between 0.7 and 0.9. It's very, very high. Now, a few weeks ago, it was between 0.5 and 0.9. Obviously, it would have been foolish to have ever thought it would be the lower end of that range. But, you know, the way government policy has been working, you might imagine it was at the lower end of that range. But it's not. Now, the scientists do believe it's falling because more recently, they did say it was between 0.7 and 1. But that was madness when they thought it could be 1 and they were still easing, government was still easing lockdown restrictions. But although they believe the R value is falling, it's only falling very slowly, they said. In fact, they said too slowly. So it has a value that's very close to 1 and its value is falling slowly, and yet we're opening up the country again. Essentially, they said, that the R value is close to 1. We've got about 54,000 new infections a week. So this is absolutely not the time to be coming unnecessarily into contact with people outside your household. So isn't it fantastic that the government are now saying that not only can you meet people from other households out in open spaces, you can do it inside households as well very soon. And yet, of course, that's the government are encouraging us to come into close contact with others. And it doesn't matter the fact that they're whispering a few things. It's like, oh yeah, you can go to the shops. We're going to open non-essential shops now. We're going to open schools. You can go and meet people from other households. You can go out for whatever reason you like. You can even go to other households. Wear a face mask. And you can have people from 6 different households soon go into another household. Stay 2 meters apart. And it is encouraging people to come into close contact. And obviously, even if they were shouting louder, the wear a face mask, which they're not, or stay 2 meters apart, which they're not, then people would ignore it anyway, because the police have already noted that when they are trying to tackle people about the lockdown measures, but the ones that still remain in place, people are basically ignoring them and citing the Dominic Cummings example. They're saying, why should we follow the law that the government who enacted the law will not follow themselves? I don't imagine it's put as eloquently as that, but that is the effect of what the police are being told, what the police are reporting they are being told. And these new rules now, or what's left of the new rules, are going to be completely unpoliceable. How do you know you've got a limited number of people round at your house? How do you know that people are staying 2 meters apart? The only way police can know that is if they see a load of cars parked outside the house, they can try and knock on the door and ask to see, and they can be round there, and they might be 2 meters apart by the time the police have got round there, but they won't have been at lots of other times. It is now unpoliceable. And like I say, many people are going to ignore the restrictions anyway, because some would anyway, because the government they've not really been instilling a fear factor to this pandemic. Now, you don't want to go mad. You know, people, locking themselves in a small room and, as if it's the nuclear holocaust. But at the same time, there isn't even an adequate level of fear about this virus. And so that in itself has got a lot of people not treating social distancing seriously. But then, you've also got the Dominic Cummings affair, which means that even some who would go with it are just out of belligerence not following the rules now. And coming back to Johnson's refusal to allow the scientists to answer questions, if he wants to disentangle politics from science, fine, no problem at all. What I would say to that is, so first of all, pull your politicians or your political advisors out of the SAGE meetings, make them entirely science-based. Also, you and some group of your cronies can hold a political briefing each day. Have some cabinet ministers there to take questions as well, maybe the Chancellor, maybe the Health Secretary, whoever. And then let the scientists conduct a separate, independent scientific briefing. If you want to disentangle politics and science, that is the way to do it. And it might be a good moment to point out that although Johnson says that the SAGE for those who don't know, it's the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, if the SAGE meeting minutes are going to be published, that's what he says, they're going to be published. They haven't been yet. He was suspected from the start that, it was going through political filters. That they weren't following the scientific advice. We sort of knew that because our scientific advice, according to ministers, was very different from the rest of the world's scientific advice. So that straight away was an head scratcher. And as soon as Johnson started blaming the scientists for missteps, because now he has to admit that they've got things wrong. So now he's saying, well, we didn't get them wrong. It was the scientists that got them wrong. To which the scientists are going, hang on a minute. No, you didn't do what we said. You didn't follow our advice. So members of the group, more members of the group than did before, have started going public about the advice that they gave and how it has been ignored. And the Prime Minister wants us to believe him as opposed to the experts. Now, that sort of worked with Brexit. I'm not sure it's really happening right now. And especially wanting to trust him when he won't even release minutes of the meetings. And this disconnect between the science and the politics was in full show in the briefing yesterday. Boris Johnson said that the 5 tests for easing the lockdown had been met. This was not echoed by the scientists present, who made it clear that they had not. He didn't say, oh, the Prime Minister's wrong, or no, the tests haven't been met, but they did describe they gave several statements which made it clear the tests had not been met. To see that, you would have to have known what the tests are. So they didn't openly defy the Prime Minister. Obviously, they can't. They might as well just resign if they're going to do that. But, reading into what they're saying, what they're essentially saying is that, You can expect the lockdown to be retightened, because if you thought the first wave was a shit show, you wait to see what's coming this summer. And it also has to be borne in mind at this point, do remember the government's plan when they were publicly talking about the herd immunity strategy was to get this thing through during the summer months. The summer months are now upon us. This is why they're easing the lockdown now. One, they think they can get away with it. Two, they want it to spread through the population like they always did. So there we have it. We have an incompetent Prime Minister, the most incompetent Prime Minister we've had in my lifetime, in the middle of a mismanaged, deadly healthcare crisis. And he's now decided to drop all pretense of democratic accountability. He not only selects the journalists which are allowed to ask questions. So if you think some of the questions at these briefings, a little bit awkward there, these are the journalists he personally has selected. Anyone that would ask genuinely awkward questions isn't invited. So he selects the ones that are allowed to ask questions. When they do ask an especially awkward question, he bans them. And he now selects the questions that even those selected journalists are allowed to answer. And even then, if he suddenly decides he doesn't like the tone of it, he won't allow the experts to answer if it's not absolutely certain that it will cover for his impotence. So there it is. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.